This crossed a line most people didn't notice at the time. In early 2019, the United States announced tariffs and threatened more. Steel, aluminum. The message was clear enough that markets reacted before governments did. Supply chains braced. Investors paused. For many countries, this kind of pressure had a predictable effect. Canada didn't move. Not because the threat wasn't real, and not because Ottawa underestimated the risk, but because pressure only works under specific conditions. When you examine the sequence of events, the legal frameworks that stayed in place, and the data that followed, it becomes clear that those conditions never fully materialized. This is analysis based on publicly available reporting and official documents. And when you strip the story down to verifiable facts rather than rhetoric, one conclusion stands out: the pressure failed. Under Donald Trump, tariffs were repeatedly used as pressure tactics in trade disputes, including major Section 232 actions on steel and aluminum. These measures were justified publicly on national security grounds, but their practical use went beyond economics. They were leverage. The logic behind that leverage is simple and well documented. First, create uncertainty. Second, compress time. Third, force decisions before alternatives can be organized. When governments and businesses don't know what rules will apply next month, they delay investment. When supply chains face sudden cost increases, firms push governments to resolve the situation quickly. That urgency is what pressure strategies rely on. Economic policy research consistently shows that uncertainty is one of the most damaging forces in trade. It doesn't need to be permanent to be effective. It just needs to be sharp enough and fast enough to overwhelm planning. That's why this approach has worked in the past. In multiple cases, governments facing tariff threats chose to soften their positions quickly. They accepted short-term concessions to restore predictability, even if the long-term costs were higher. From a political standpoint, that trade-off often looked rational. Pressure thrives on fear, but fear has a shelf life. When governments believe they have time, when legal frameworks limit sudden change, and when alternatives exist, the mechanics of pressure start to break down. That distinction matters. To understand why pressure failed in this case, the sequence of events is more important than any single announcement. In 2018, the United States imposed Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum imports, including those from Canada. Canada responded with retaliatory measures, but both sides kept negotiations open. The situation created uncertainty, but it did not dismantle the underlying trade framework. In May 2019, the United States and Canada reached an agreement to lift those tariffs. Retaliatory measures were removed. The immediate pressure point disappeared. What remained was the legal structure governing trade. The United States-Mexico-Canada agreement had already been negotiated and was moving toward implementation. When it entered into force in July 2020, it became the binding framework for North American trade. That sequence matters. Pressure strategies are most effective when they can permanently change access. In this case, the tariffs were temporary, and the governing framework was reinforced rather than replaced. From a leverage perspective, that is a critical limitation. Long before tariffs became a dominant headline, Canada had been working quietly on a different problem: dependence. Canada's economy is deeply integrated with the United States. That integration has long been treated as a strength, but it also creates vulnerability. When a single partner accounts for a dominant share of trade, pressure from that partner carries more weight. Canada did not eliminate that dependence. That would be unrealistic. What it did instead was reduce exposure at the margins. Official government data shows sustained efforts to expand trade relationships beyond the United States, particularly with the European Union and overseas markets. Agreements like CETA were not designed as substitutes for U.S. trade, but they created additional options. Those options matter under pressure. International financial institutions have found that diversified supply chains and export markets tend to be more resilient to tariff shocks. The effect is not immediate and not dramatic. It does not make pressure disappear. What it does is slow it down. When pressure hits, governments with diversified trade profiles have more room to maneuver. They are less likely to face immediate collapse in a single sector. They can afford to wait. Canada also invested in regulatory and institutional capacity. Customs systems, trade facilitation processes, and legal dispute mechanisms were strengthened over time. None of this makes headlines. All of it reduces panic. In Ottawa terms, this wasn't dramatic. It was procedural, and that was the point. Pressure strategies often rely on a specific expectation. Markets seize, trade flows break, access disappears. That didn't happen here. Available indicators from official trade data suggest that the core trade framework and market access between Canada and the United States did not collapse in the way many pressure campaigns rely on. Trade volumes fluctuated, as they always do, but the legal basis for access remained intact. The USMCA continued to govern trade relations. Supply chains adjusted rather than disintegrated. Firms absorbed costs, rerouted inputs, and waited for clarity. This distinction is important. Tariffs introduce friction. They raise costs. They create inefficiencies. None of that should be minimized. But intimidation alone did not force a structural reset of the relationship. Based on publicly available data, the collapse that pressure depends on never materialized. Steel and aluminum are often cited as proof that pressure worked. The reality is more complicated. The tariffs imposed under Section 232 were significant. They disrupted pricing, forced adjustments, and triggered retaliation. But they were also explicitly temporary. Negotiations continued. And in May 2019, the tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum were lifted. What followed was revealing. Trade resumed under the existing framework. Retaliatory measures were removed. Industries adjusted back toward stability. The episode introduced costs, but it did not produce lasting control. From a leverage standpoint, the lesson is clear. Pressure that can be reversed quickly loses much of its power. Once businesses and governments learn that access is likely to be restored, fear fades. And when fear fades, urgency disappears. To understand why Canada's experience stands out, it helps to look at the broader pattern. In many cases, governments facing tariff threats prioritized speed over structure. They sought quick resolutions to stabilize markets and reassure domestic industries. That often meant accepting concessions early. This approach is not irrational. Short-term stability has political value. Leaders are judged on immediate outcomes, not long-term leverage. Under intense pressure, the incentive to settle quickly is strong. But that approach has a cost. Early concessions validate the pressure strategy. They reinforce the idea that threats work, and they reduce the incentive for the coercing party to moderate its behavior. Canada chose a different path, not by escalating, and not by posturing publicly, but by refusing to compress its decision-making timeline. That difference in timing changed the outcome. One of the least discussed aspects of this episode is the role of institutions. Pressure strategies are designed to bypass them. By creating urgency, they push decisions into the political realm, where speed and optics dominate. Legal processes, regulatory review, and multilateral norms become obstacles to be ignored. Canada leaned into those obstacles. Legal frameworks constrained rapid change. Regulatory systems slowed escalation. Dispute mechanisms created channels other than confrontation. This wasn't defiance, it was containment. By relying on institutions, Canada reduced uncertainty rather than amplifying it. Businesses could plan around known rules, even if those rules were imperfect. That stability mattered more than rhetoric. The most significant effects of pressure rarely appear in the first announcement. They show up later. International economic analysis shows that trade policy uncertainty is a persistent drag on activity. When firms cannot predict future costs, they delay investment. When rules feel unstable, supply chains are redesigned. These adjustments happen quietly. They are not captured by daily headlines. But over time, they reshape relationships. Tariffs raise costs on both sides. Uncertainty encourages diversification. Partners begin to reduce reliance, not out of hostility, but out of caution. These second-order effects are difficult to reverse. Once supply chains move, they rarely return fully to previous configurations. Once trust erodes, it takes years to rebuild. Pressure strategies that rely on repeated shocks accelerate this process. It's important to be precise about what held this relationship together. The USMCA is not symbolic. It is a binding legal agreement. Throughout this period, it remained the governing framework for trade between Canada and the United States. That framework constrained outcomes. It limited how far pressure could go without triggering legal consequences. It created predictability in key areas, and it signaled to markets that access was not being dismantled wholesale. This matters for leverage. Pressure is most effective when rules are unclear and access is discretionary. In this case, access was defined by treaty. Canada did not preserve that framework through confrontation. It preserved it by insisting on continuity. The agreement held. Here's the line that matters. When fear disappears, pressure stops being leverage and becomes noise. That doesn't mean pressure has no cost. It means it no longer controls outcomes. In this case, fear never reached the level required to force rapid concession. The legal framework stayed in place. Alternatives existed. Time was available. Pressure lost its edge. This is not a story about victory. Canada did not win a showdown. Costs were incurred. Uncertainty increased. Adjustments were required. This is also not a story about confrontation. Canada did not defeat pressure by escalating or by humiliating its counterpart. It avoided spectacle almost entirely. And it is not a story about personalities. This outcome did not depend on rhetoric or theatrics. It depended on structure. That distinction is important. While the immediate pressure failed, the relationship did change. Trust weakened. Automatic assumptions disappeared. Businesses and governments adjusted their expectations. According to current reporting, parts of the USMCA framework are already under discussion for potential reforms. That reflects a broader reality. The relationship has entered a more cautious phase. This is not collapse. It is recalibration. Canada now approaches the relationship with calculation rather than confidence. That is a different posture, and it carries different costs and benefits. But it is more resilient. Other governments are paying attention, not because this episode generated dramatic headlines, but because it demonstrated something practical. Pressure strategies are not universally effective. They depend on timing, fear, and alternatives. When those conditions are absent, pressure produces adjustment rather than control. That lesson is portable. It does not require confrontation. It requires preparation. Donald Trump's pressure strategy assumed that fear would force compliance. In Canada's case, it didn't. The trade framework remained intact. Market access continued. Alternatives existed. Time was available. Pressure without fear lost leverage. This does not mean pressure will never work again. It means it has limits. And once those limits are exposed, they are hard to ignore. That changes the math.